The lock clicked behind me, and the sound was heavier than it had any right to be. I stared at the heavy steel door of Cell 7, the scratches along its frame deepened by decades of restless fingers, desperate hands. The fluorescent light overhead flickered once and went dark for a moment before buzzing weakly back to life. Outside, the corridor was silent, sterile, but eerily quiet. Not the usual hum of machinery or the distant clatter of boots on concrete. Just silence. I had no idea how long I'd been at it, how long this nightmare had been creeping over the world. They said there were riots in the city, looting, people dying in the streets. The news reports had been chaotic, frantic, half journalistic, half panic. But this was real. The air smelled wrong, a mixture of bleach and decay. My gut twisted at the thought that whatever had happened outside had probably turned the world into something unrecognizable. I tried the door. It wouldn't budge. I rattled it with both hands, slamming my shoulder into the steel. Nothing. The heavy lock held fast. Every instinct in me screamed that staying here meant death, if not from hunger, then from something far worse. I pressed my face to the bars, listening. Hallway footsteps, but irregular shuffling, dragging, and then a low, wet groan. My stomach dropped. Zombies. The reports hadn't lied. I stumbled back from the bars, my heart hammering. I wasn't a fighter. Never had been. I'd played sports in high school, sure, but nothing that prepared a man for the collapse of civilization, for the slow, relentless menace of the dead who somehow still wanted to eat. I sank to the cold concrete floor, my back against the wall. Panic was useless. Survival meant thinking rational, careful thinking. I had to map my options. There were none. The window was too high to reach. The door was steel. My cell had a thin mattress, a toilet, and a sink, basically nothing. But even as despair crept in, a stubborn spark ignited. I had survived worse than bad luck before. Life was stubborn. So was I. I spent the first hours pacing, studying my environment. Every inch of that cell became a potential tool. The metal tray from the meal slot could be bent. The sink pipes looked sturdy. The bars of the door hollow, maybe? I tried tapping and listening, but even the faintest vibration told me nothing. I realized then the first rule: conserve energy, observe, improvise. Food was a problem. The small tray slot was my only source so far, but no one came. Not today, not yesterday, no one. I'd long ago stopped expecting help. Hunger became a strange kind of companion, gnawing, sharpening my focus, forcing me to plan. I started small. I collected scraps, crumbs, even smudges of leftover oatmeal from the tray edges. The human body could stretch further than we give it credit for. The days blurred. I marked them on the wall with tiny scratches, a calendar of survival. Each scratch was a lifeline, a reminder that I was still here. Nights were worse. Shadows moved outside the bars. I couldn't tell if it was the building shifting, a flicker of my imagination, or something real. I learned quickly not to assume safety anywhere. Even my own fear was a threat. Panic could kill faster than hunger. Creativity became my shield. I used the sink as a makeshift water filter, layering scraps of clothing to strain any debris. I learned to ration every drop. The tray became a multi-tool, a scraper, a lever. I even tested its weight against the bars, imagining if repeated force could loosen a bolt or wear down a hinge. Isolation gnawed at my mind almost as badly as hunger. I spoke aloud to maintain my grip on reality. You're here, you're alive, and you're not done. Sometimes I'd recount memories of my family, my last meal before the chaos, the way rain smelled in the spring. It felt ridiculous, but it kept the edges of my sanity from fraying. By the end of the first week, I was no longer just a man in a cell. I was a strategist, Every shadow outside, every distant groan, every echo down the corridor became data. Patterns emerged. The zombies weren't coordinated, they stumbled, sniffed, reacted to noise. Occasionally, I caught glimpses of others trapped, hopeless, and that reinforced a grim truth. No one was coming. But there was a breakthrough, accidental at first. One night, I dropped the tray. It clattered against the floor outside the bars, making a horrid metallic noise. One of the things shuffled closer, dragging its feet, sniffing the air. It was slow, clumsy. Then I noticed a gap. The way it moved meant there were blind spots, paths it couldn't see, paths I could exploit. I started to experiment. Small, controlled noises, observing reactions, learning the limits of what I could do safely. I fashioned a rope from torn sheets, tying it into a rough pulley to reach the slot on the food door without exposing myself. It worked. I got scraps, even half-rotted supplies abandoned in the hallway. My first real success. And it tasted like victory. By the second week, my mind had turned into a machine for survival. I slept in shifts, moved in silence, scavenged meticulously. Hunger became secondary to the thrill of problem-solving. My cell, my prison, was now a laboratory. I was learning everything I could about the weaknesses of the building, the gaps in the creature's awareness, the leverage of metal, the stubborn endurance of the human body. I started thinking bigger. The bars, they were thick, yes, but not infinite. I tested the hinges with repeated force, listening, feeling, learning. I watched the floor for cracks, the ceiling for weaknesses. If a man was desperate enough, he could find a way. I would find a way. And then came the night I realized something terrifying, but also exhilarating. I wasn't just surviving. I was planning escape. By the end of the second week, my cell felt less like a prison and more like a command center. Every inch of concrete, every scratch on the wall, every dent in the metal tray had a purpose. I had discovered routines in the world outside my bars, a grotesque rhythm of shuffling feet, distant groans, and occasional screams that would echo down the hallway like warnings. I learned to read it like a book. Food remained scarce. I had managed to scavenge scraps from the hallways, rotting bread, a tin of beans that had somehow survived, puddles of water collected from a leaky pipe. I improvised. I turned the tray into a makeshift scoop to fish out water, straining it through layers of my clothing. I boiled it using a tiny fire I managed to spark with a piece of flint I found hidden behind the sink pipe. The heat singed my fingers at first, but the water tasted like life. The nights were still the hardest. I learned to track the sounds of the undead in the building, the slow, wet rhythm of their steps, the occasional clanging of a dropped object, the hollow groans that carried down the corridor. There were patterns, and patterns meant predictability. Predictability meant opportunities. It was during one of these nights that I noticed something new. A vent, high on the wall near the ceiling, partially covered with rusted metal grating. I could see faint moonlight through it. It was just a sliver, a crack in the fortress that had become my world, but it was a crack nonetheless. My mind raced. Could I use it? The thought was intoxicating. I began crafting tools. The metal tray became a lever. My shoestrings became lashings. Scraps of clothing became padding for grip. Each day I tested, probed, and measured. The vent was small. The screws rusted. But nothing was impossible if you applied patience and force. Then came the first direct threat. One morning, the shuffling outside the door intensified. Groans closer, more urgent. I froze, heart hammering. Peeking through the bars, I saw it, one of them, a hulking, twisted figure leaning against the corridor wall. Its eyes were clouded, mouth gaping, teeth yellowed and jagged. And it wasn't alone. There were more, drawn by some unseen signal, congregating in a pile of moans and stench. Panic almost took me, but I remembered the rules. Conserve energy, observe, improvise. I waited. They shuffled in patterns, circling, but never learning. I counted their steps, mapped their blind spots. Using a piece of torn cloth, I dropped a tiny scrap to the side. It hit the floor with a faint thud. Two of them shuffled toward it. The others remained distracted. Victory, small but critical. I had bought myself a window of time. That night, I tested the tray against the hinge of my door, not in a desperate bang, but in measured taps. The metal groaned, slightly bending under repeated force. I also experimented with psychological tricks. I began mimicking noises from the hallway, experimenting with tones to lure them away or distract them. The vent above remained a secret focus. Each day, I refined my tools, tightened my patience. Hunger began to sharpen rather than weaken me. I rationed carefully, sometimes going half a day without food, focusing instead on the tasks that might lead to freedom. Days turned into weeks, and I marked every passing one with small scratches in the wall, the tally growing like the count of battles fought silently in a cell. Then, disaster, or what I thought was disaster. One morning, I awoke to a low growl just outside my door. I froze, heart hammering. The shuffling had grown closer overnight. And there it was, the first real breach attempt. One of them had leaned too close to my door, claws scraping against metal. A shard of panic surged through me, but I didn't run. I didn't scream. I observed. Its movements were awkward, repetitive, almost predictable. The nails scratched, but they weren't strong enough to force the lock. I had learned enough. I tapped back, softly, carefully, mimicking a sound elsewhere in the hallway. It paused, tilted its head, then shuffled away, leaving me trembling but alive. That night, I realized the next step. Survival wasn't enough anymore. I had to escape. The vent wasn't just a crack, it was the way out. I spent days fashioning a pulley of sorts, tying sheets together, testing how much weight I could bear. I tested the screws on the vent cover with the tray. They were stubborn, but rust was a friend. Repeated pressure, repeated attempts, and they started to loosen. By the end of the third week, I had a plan forming a sequence of movements, distractions, and tools that might allow me to climb through the vent and into the hallway beyond, unseen, unheard. I felt the first true surge of hope since being locked in. For the first time, the cell felt like a stepping stone, not a tomb. And yet, fear lingered. Every night, I imagined the horror waiting outside. Every step beyond my cell would be a gamble. One misstep could mean death. But I had learned patience, observation, improvisation. I had become a strategist in a cage. And now, freedom wasn't just a dream, it was a challenge I could meet. By the fourth week, I had mapped the building in my mind like a battle plan. The hallway outside my cell was a grotesque maze of shadows, groans, and shuffling corpses. Every step had to be calculated, every movement precise. The vent above my lifeline was within reach, but it was stubborn. I had loosened the screws with the tray, but the cover still clung tightly. Hunger was gnawing harder now. My body had stretched its limits, muscles taut under the stress of confinement, my stomach twisting endlessly. I learned to ignore it, turning the pangs into focus. My mind became sharper with deprivation. Every problem had a solution if I was patient enough to find it. That night, I made the first move. I tied the sheet rope I had fashioned to the bars, looping it around my waist for safety. I climbed cautiously, heart hammering, hand over hand, feeling the coarse fabric dig into my palms. The vent was just above me. I could see the moonlight slivering through its rusted grating like a promise. I tested the screws again, A twist, a push, a lever, then a metallic creak. The cover budged. I froze. Every instinct screamed caution. I waited, listening. The hallway was silent. The groans had receded. Timing was everything. I pushed again. The cover shifted. One more careful push, and it came loose. Freedom smelled like rust and moonlight. I crawled inside, feeling the cool metal of the vent under my hands. The passage was tight, claustrophobic, and filled with dust. My breaths were shallow, every sound amplified in the narrow tunnel. I inched forward, listening, feeling the vibrations of footsteps and groans below me. The vent led to another hallway, the corridor of opportunity. I emerged silently, dropping to the floor. The air was thick with the smell of decay. Shadows moved at the edges of my vision, groans echoing from every corner. I pressed myself against the wall. My first instinct was to run, but my mind reminded me, observe, improvise, survive. I had no weapon, no backup, only my wits. I scanned the floor. A broken broom handle lay abandoned near a corpse, slumped against the wall. I grabbed it. It wasn't much, but it would do. The corridor seemed endless, a torturous stretch of shadow and death. I avoided bodies, bypassed doors that creaked ominously, and listened for the slightest sound. My breathing was shallow, my body taut with anticipation. Every sense screamed alert. And then disaster struck. A groan, a low, wet, horrifying sound came from the left. I froze. One of them had noticed me. Its eyes clouded, mouth hanging open. It stumbled forward, slow but relentless. I raised the broom handle, my hand trembling, ready to strike. The creature lunged. I jabbed. Its weight hit me as the handle splintered. I fell back, rolling to avoid its grasp. Heart hammering, I scrambled to my feet. I ran. Not blindly, but strategically, zigzagging to avoid its clumsy lunges. I ducked into a side room, slammed the door, and held my breath. Silence. My body shook. Sweat stung my eyes. I gripped the broom handle shard, my knuckles white. The hallway was clear for now. I pressed onward, crawling through another vent into a small storage room. Boxes of old supplies, cans, cloth, tools lay scattered. My heart leapt. Improvised weapons. Fire-starting tools. Cans for distractions. Every item was a resource. I fashioned a crude slingshot with a strip of cloth and a metal bolt. Every step I took from here on out became a game of survival and misdirection. I could toss a bolt to the side, draw attention, and slip by unnoticed. Every groan, every shuffling foot became part of my map, my puzzle. By the time I reached the main hallway, the first light of dawn was creeping through broken windows. The city beyond the jail, a twisted vision of apocalypse, lay silent under a pale sun. Bodies littered the streets. Fires burned in the distance, and I was alive. But the thrill of escape was tempered by exhaustion. My muscles screamed, my stomach ached, and every step was agony. I found an abandoned room, barricaded the door with crates, and collapsed. For the first time, I allowed myself a long, deep breath. I had made it out of the cell, survived the first corridor, and lived. But the world beyond was no friend. I realized then the stark truth. Survival had only just begun. The city was crawling with the dead, and my freedom was nothing more than a step into chaos. Hunger, fear, and the relentless undead waited for me outside. But I had tasted freedom, and that taste, sharp, bitter, exhilarating, was all the fuel I needed. The city smelled like fire and rot. Smoke curled from distant buildings, blackening the pale morning light. I had imagined freedom as something bright and open, but the world outside the cell was darker than I could have feared. The streets were littered with abandoned vehicles, strewn belongings, and bodies frozen mid-motion, some human, some not. I forced myself to breathe slowly, to focus. Panic would get me killed. I had no map, no plan, but I had observation and ingenuity. I had learned these in the cell, and now they were my lifeline. Every street became a puzzle, every shadow a potential threat. I moved cautiously, sticking to alleys, using the skeletons of cars as cover. My broom handle shard was my only weapon, but it would have to do. I discovered quickly that speed was as important as stealth. One wrong step, the crack of a floorboard, the clatter of a tin, could draw attention. I improvised constantly. Empty cans tied with string became makeshift noise traps, metal scraps to create diversions. I learned to listen for echoes, to predict where a creature might stumble, to use its blind spots. By the second day, I had begun to scavenge for supplies. Abandoned stores were treasure troves if one was careful. I found a backpack, half empty, with some canned goods and a water bottle. Each discovery felt like a small victory, each resource a lifeline. But the real danger wasn't hunger, it was movement. The dead were everywhere, slow but relentless, drawn by noise, light, even the faintest scent of fear. I realized quickly that I couldn't stay in one place for long. My cell had been my fortress. The city was a trap. I developed a system. Observe, improvise, move, always move. I became adept at reading the environment. A toppled fence became a ladder, a broken window a lookout, a pile of debris a barricade. Creativity wasn't just helpful, it was survival. One afternoon, I found a narrow fire escape leading to the rooftops. The climb was treacherous, rusted metal groaning under my weight, but it offered a perspective I had never had, a bird's-eye view of the city. From above, I could see the spread of destruction, but also paths that might be safer. The rooftops became my highways, dodging the dead, moving silently from building to building. Night brought new challenges. The shadows became deeper, the groans closer, the cold sharper. I had no shelter, no warmth, and yet sleep was necessary. I learned to sleep in shifts, dozing lightly, one eye open, one hand ready to strike. Exhaustion was a dangerous adversary, almost as deadly as the creatures themselves. And then came the first true test, a horde moving through a narrow street I had planned to cross. I froze, watching them shuffle, a grotesque wave of decay and hunger. My initial instinct was to run, but the patterns I had learned in the cell kicked in. I observed their movement, counted steps, and noticed gaps, tiny fleeting windows between clusters of the undead. Using a broken plank as a lever, I made noise at one end of the street, drawing a few of the creatures away. It worked barely. I darted through the gap, heart hammering, lungs burning. I stumbled but stayed upright. Every instinct screamed danger, but I was alive. For the first time outside my cell, I felt the rush of real survival. I realized then that my imprisonment had taught me something vital. Patience, observation, and creativity were more powerful than brute force. I could fight, yes, but only as a last resort. The world had changed, and only adaptability would save me. By the end of the week, I had established a fragile routine. Scavenge during the day, move silently, use rooftops and alleys to avoid contact, and sleep in small, hidden spaces. I had made the city a manageable puzzle rather than an overwhelming threat. My confidence grew, not arrogance, but a quiet certainty that I could survive. And yet, the vent in my cell, the first symbol of freedom, remained with me in memory. It had taught me that ingenuity could overcome walls, that the human mind could find openings where none seemed to exist. Now, beyond the cell, that lesson became my creed. Every obstacle had a solution if I was clever enough to see it. The The city had become a labyrinth of decay. Streets were blocked by abandoned cars, fallen debris, and the occasional fire that had burned too long to be useful, only leaving ash and smoke in its wake. The undead moved slowly, but they were relentless, and the noise I made, even a whisper of sound, could draw them like moths to a flame. I had learned to improvise constantly, but this day demanded more than simple tricks. I needed a route through a part of the city I had avoided, a sector I'd only glimpsed from the rooftops, a tangle of alleyways, warehouses, and derelict apartments. I had seen it bristling with danger from above, clusters of the undead, some moving in patterns, some stationary but aware, like shadows that watched me from the corners of my mind. I approached at dusk, using a sequence of rooftops to stay out of reach. My legs ached from weeks of climbing, my stomach twisted with hunger, but adrenaline kept me sharp. I paused atop a crumbling wall and surveyed the street below. The narrow alley leading to my intended path was flanked by two hulking figures, grotesque, decaying, swaying. One misstep would mean death, I observed. They swayed in a pattern, their attention drawn to the smallest sound. Timing would be everything. I gathered small debris into a sling. I had fashioned a tin can, a loose brick, and practiced. Aim, force, distraction. A gentle toss to one side, a louder crash to the other, and I could slip through the gap. The first throw went as planned. One staggered toward the noise, the other paused, then shuffled away. I ran, feet barely touching the ground. Every second was life or death. I slid through a narrow opening in a fence, scraping my shoulder but escaping unnoticed. I didn't stop. I had learned that hesitation was fatal. Every moment of indecision could be my last. I ducked into a warehouse, the shadows my ally. Inside, I found supplies left behind. Cans, bottles, a tattered tarp. I scavenged silently, careful not to disturb the precarious stacks of crates. Every item was precious. Night fell fully, and the warehouse became a temporary fortress. I blocked the doors with heavy crates and slept lightly, senses alert. Morning brought a new challenge. The warehouse floor had a hole in the roof, sunlight streaming through. Beneath it, a small horde had gathered, drawn by the smell of decay from the street. They were slow but steady, and any movement outside could draw their attention. I needed to reach a fire escape leading to the next rooftop. I studied their behavior. They were predictable. One tripped on a loose beam, another leaned toward the sunlight. Using scraps of metal and a few bricks, I created a small diversion, a clatter here, a crash there. The creatures responded exactly as I had anticipated. I darted for the fire escape, leaping, grasping, and climbing to the safety of the roof above. Every rooftop became a corridor of calculated risk. I learned to jump gaps, to use fallen scaffolding as bridges, to silently navigate from building to building. I was no longer just surviving, I was mastering the city. The freedom I had first tasted outside the cell had grown into a skill. Observation, patience, improvisation, and courage. And yet, there was a nagging thought that refused to leave me. The city was vast, but I was trapped in its core. The edge, the way out, remained distant and uncertain. I needed a plan, a route beyond the ruins, a path to safety. But that would require resources, cunning, and perhaps the boldest improvisation yet. The night stretched long, and I found myself atop a deserted apartment, looking at the horizon. Smoke rose from the distant fires, and the city seemed endless. I pressed my back against the wall, exhausted but alive, my mind turning over possibilities. Every tool I had, every lesson I'd learned, would need to be used in the coming days. The day began with a creeping sense of danger. I had been moving along the rooftops for hours, scavenging, observing, plotting my next move. Hunger had become a constant companion. gnawing at my insides, but it was manageable. Fear, however, was a sharper edge. The city was alive with the dead, and every sound, every shadow, every shifting shape could mean my end. I had spotted a potential route through a section of buildings that seemed less populated, narrow alleys, broken bridges, and a chain of rooftops leading toward what I hoped was the edge of the city. The plan was simple: move fast, avoid confrontation, improvise wherever obstacles arose. But simplicity rarely survives contact with reality. As I dropped onto a rooftop near the first alley, I froze. A horde had gathered below, drawn perhaps by my previous movements. Their moans filled the street, a wet, hungry chorus that echoed between the buildings. One misstep, and I would be surrounded. I ducked behind a crumbling wall. The alley was narrow, but I could use it. I began to improvise, scanning the surroundings. Loose metal sheets, abandoned cans, broken wood. I could create distractions. I could control the chaos. But I would need precision. One slip, one misjudged throw, and I'd be dead. I gathered small debris, arranging cans and bricks to act as noise triggers. My plan was to lure the horde away from the alley, creating a temporary path. I tossed a brick to the far end of the street. A few of them staggered toward it. I made a noise on the opposite side, drawing another cluster away. Slowly, agonizingly, I carved a corridor of safety. Then, disaster. A taller, faster one, a hybrid of sorts, half decayed, somehow sharper, noticed me. It broke from the group, moving with an unnerving awareness. I realized it wasn't just instinct-driven, it was thinking, hunting. I slammed a metal sheet down, creating a barrier between us. It stumbled, but only briefly. Its eyes, milky and wet, tracked me relentlessly. I ran, zigzagging, keeping my distance. I grabbed a loose plank and swung it like a club, connecting with its head. A wet crunch, but it kept coming. I had to climb fast. A fire escape loomed ahead. I threw myself at it, hands gripping rusted metal, scraping skin, muscles screaming. Up, up, up! The creature followed, but the escape was narrow. Its bulk got caught. I heard the tearing of metal and flesh, a sickening sound, but it bought me precious seconds. I emerged onto another rooftop, lungs burning, heart pounding, adrenaline coursing through every vein. The city stretched before me, a jagged horizon of destruction, smoke, ash, and decay. I began to plan, mentally mapping the rooftops, alleys, and hazards ahead. Improvised weapons, traps, and distractions would be my allies. The dead were predictable in their patterns, but only if I observed closely. Night fell. I found shelter atop an abandoned office building, barricading the entrance with crates and debris. I ate sparingly, conserving strength. Hunger was still gnawing, but fear had become a distant second to calculation. I thought about my cell, the vent, the way I had learned patience and observation. All of it had prepared me for this moment. The city, like the cell, could be read, understood, and outmaneuvered. By the next morning, I had a clear route. It was audacious, dangerous, and precise. I would move across rooftops, descend into a narrow alley that served as a hidden shortcut, and emerge near the outskirts of the city. The path required every skill I had honed in the cell and beyond: observation, improvisation, timing, and fearlessness. I began the journey, moving silently, every step calculated. I leapt across rooftops, crawled through tight passages, and used improvised traps to distract clusters of the undead. Each success built my confidence. Each obstacle sharpened my focus. I was no longer just surviving. I was mastering the city. And then I reached the final stretch, a crumbling warehouse, partially collapsed, bridging the gap to freedom. The alley below was clear, the rooftop stable, the horizon open. I could see trees, open fields beyond the city. Safety, or at least a step toward it, was within reach. But the horde had grown restless. Drawn by movement, sound, and instinct, they shifted, regrouped, and began to converge. My heart pounded. I had one chance, one precise series of moves. Improvised distractions, timed leaps, and sheer determination. Every muscle, every thought, every plan would be tested to the limit. And I moved. The horizon was so close I could taste it: fields, trees, open air beyond the crumbling skyline of the city. But the last stretch was the deadliest. The warehouse I had to cross was half collapsed, the remaining structure groaning under its own weight. Below, the alley stretched like a dark vein, and somewhere in the shadows, the horde stirred. I crouched on the rooftop across from the warehouse, surveying my path. Timing was everything. One false move, one snap of a rusted beam, and it could all be over. I checked my makeshift weapons, a splintered broom handle, a metal shard, and my improvised sling. Each item was fragile, but they were all I had. I took a deep breath, centering myself. Hunger, exhaustion, fear. They were constants, but I refused to let them control me. I remembered the cell, the vent, the weeks of patience and observation that had brought me here. Every lesson I had learned now counted. Every misstep from before had taught me how to survive. I moved first to the edge of the warehouse roof. The boards were rotten and unstable. I tested each step with my foot, listening for the telltale crack, the sound of weakness. Slowly, carefully, I advanced, inching toward the next solid beam. Then the horde noticed me. A shuffling, guttural chorus erupted from the alley below. My heart leapt into my throat. I froze, listening. They were disoriented by distance, but moving toward the noise. I had to act fast. I grabbed a loose metal sheet and hurled it across the alley. It clattered, bounced, and skidded into a pile of debris. Some of the creatures shuffled toward it, distracted. That was my window. I sprinted across the weakened roof, leapt over a gap that should have been impossible, and landed hard on the remaining intact beam. Pain shot through my leg, but I ignored it. I moved like a ghost, swift and silent, heading for the fire escape that would take me to the alley below the final passage. Halfway down, a beam cracked beneath me. I swore, gripping the rusted metal with all my strength. The floor below was littered with broken glass and debris. A misstep would be fatal. One of the undead, drawn by the noise, appeared at the far end of the alley, its eyes locked on me. I twisted, kicked, and used the last of my makeshift sling to toss a brick. The creature lunged, but the distraction worked. I slipped through the gap and landed hard, rolling to absorb the impact. The alley was narrow, but open enough for speed. I ran, weaving between overturned carts, trash, and fallen signs, feeling the presence of the dead behind me. Some stumbled, some groaned, but I didn't stop. My lungs burned, my legs screamed, and the metallic taste of blood mine from a scraped hand filled my mouth. I didn't care. The edge of the city was close. Freedom was close. Finally, I saw it. The wall of trees at the city's edge. Beyond them, open fields, the smell of life, the promise of air untainted by rot. The horde's numbers thinned as I approached, slowed by rubble and obstacles. I sprinted, adrenaline blinding me to pain. And then, the final obstacle, a fallen chain-link fence, half covered with debris. I vaulted over it, catching on jagged metal, tearing my shirt, cutting my palms, but I didn't stop. I landed on the other side, sprawling onto soft earth, grass brushing my face. I looked back. The city, the dead, the chaos, all behind me. I lay there, gasping, every inch of my body screaming. For the first time in weeks, I tasted pure, unfiltered relief. The horizon was open. The air smelled of something alive. I was free. But freedom was not the same as safety. I knew that. I had survived the cell, the rooftops, the alleyways, the horde, but now I had to survive the unknown beyond the city. Still, as I pulled myself to my feet and looked out at the fields, the wind in my hair, the sun breaking over the horizon, I smiled. I had beaten walls, hunger, and the dead. I had used my mind, my courage, my ingenuity, and I was alive. The city behind me groaned, shuddered, and burned in silence. The dead shuffled, trapped in their decaying maze. I stepped forward, every step heavy with exhaustion, but light with hope. For the first time, I was not running from a cell, a city, or monsters. I was running toward life, and nothing could stop me now. The first few steps beyond the city felt unreal. Grass brushed my hands. The earth beneath my feet was soft for the first time in weeks, and the wind carried no stench of rot. The horizon stretched open, a vast expanse of possibility. I was alive, truly alive, and for the first time since the cell, I could breathe without fear pressing on my chest. But survival didn't end at the city's edge. Hunger still gnawed at me. My body was battered, my hands raw, and my mind was exhausted. I had no supplies beyond what I had scavenged, no allies, no safety net. I found a small stream and drank deeply, letting the cool water soothe my parched throat. I scavenged berries from low bushes, testing each before eating, cautious of the unfamiliar. My body was weak, but it responded. Hunger sharpened my focus rather than dulling it. I moved slowly, deliberately, avoiding sudden noises, practicing the same careful observation that had saved me in the city. The sun climbed higher, and with it came the realization that I was alone in the world but not helpless. My mind, trained by confinement and crisis, was my greatest weapon. I began to plan. Shelter, food, water, routes for movement, hiding spots, traps. Every skill honed in the jail cell, every lesson learned during my rooftop and alleyway escapades became a tool for the next chapter of survival. As evening fell, I found an abandoned farmhouse on the edge of the fields. Its door hung crooked on rusted hinges, but the structure was sound. I moved inside, barricading the entrance with fallen beams. Inside, I found remnants of life, a few cans, a rusty kettle, and a bed frame that could serve as support for storage. It wasn't much, but it was enough to begin. For the first time in weeks, I had a base. Night brought silence, a sharp, restorative contrast to the constant moans and groans of the city. I lit a small fire, cooking the berries I had gathered and boiling water from the stream. I sat beside the flames, exhausted but alive, and allowed my mind to wander. I thought of the cell, the vent, the days of scraping together survival, and the final sprint to freedom. Sleep came slowly that night, but it was deep and unbroken. For the first time, I wasn't guarding myself against the dead, against hunger, against despair. I was resting, recovering, living. And as I drifted off, I felt a profound sense of closure. When I awoke, the world beyond the city stretched before me, fields, forests, and distant hills untouched by decay. I took a deep breath, feeling the air fill my lungs, tasting life itself. I knew the journey ahead would not be easy. The world was still dangerous, still broken. But I had learned something no one could take from me. The human mind, when forced to adapt, to observe, to improvise, can find freedom even in the tightest cage. And so, I stepped forward, leaving the city, the dead, and my past confinement behind.